Welcome back to Deframing Stories. In this second episode, we are going to delve deep into the core of our Senegal's reportage and the main reason we went there, Casamance.
First of all, where is Casamance? Located between Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, Casamance has always been distinguished from the rest of Senegal due to its geographical characteristics and positioning. We can immediately see how the drawing of borders makes this region pretty isolated from the north. Also, its landscape is very different. If the majority of Senegal is characterized by a Sahelian and arid environment, Casamance is lush, dense with rivers, mangroves, and rice fields. In truth, it has been considered as the breadbasket of Senegal.
Second, why Casamance? And have you ever heard about it? Not many might know, but Casamance has been the home of Africa's longest running conflict, having officially started in 1982. But the real story began much before, and that's where we are going to start from.
This part of West Africa has been inhabited by a variety of different ethnic groups, but for what concerns the area of Lower Casamance, what today is the region of Ziguinchor, closer to the coast, the Diola, or Jola, are the main ethnic group. The Diola had been predominantly animists, with strong traditions of rice cultivation, and were not with a centralized authority. Some of their animistic traditions were related to the importance of sacred trees, as it can be seen by the presence of huge and majestic fromagère trees in many settlements. The various villages were usually autonomous, with several existing chiefdoms whose rulers could kind of be compared to local kings. But their societies had several egalitarian aspects, and due to its structure, they were resistant to centralized hierarchical authorities.
This is reflected in the colonial history of this area, because, of course, the Europeans arrived also here and brought the disruption and destruction of colonialism.
The first to arrive were the Portuguese, who established their colony of Portuguese Guinea, now Guinea-Bissau, and also reached Casamance. They struggled to control and penetrate this area due to the resistance of the population. As with many areas of the world, the great game between colonial powers defined the borders and separated communities. While the British kept the colony of Gambia around the river of the same name, Portugal and France came to an agreement, with France that was granted the control of what is Casamance, and the Portuguese consolidated their control over Guinea-Bissau. Note that all these borders are very arbitrary and didn't take into account at all the cultural similarities between the inhabitants of this area.
In fact, even today, Casamance shares cultural proximity with Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, and the same can be said for Gambia and Senegal, and with many more of the border areas between the different countries.
So, once the French arrived in Casamance at the end of the 19th century, they also faced strong resistance from the local population, and instead of direct fight, they were able to penetrate Casamance through agreements with local chiefdoms. Casamance was administered separately than the rest of Senegal, and with less control from the French. To escape forced enlistment during world wars with the French army, the local population started to ingeniously build two-story houses, something unseen before here, where the men could hide from the soldiers.
The French colonial administration was already creating a separation between Senegal and Casamance. On one side, due to geographical location. On the other sides, due to cultural identities and separate controls most of all.
In 1947, a group of local intellectuals founded the original movement of democratic forces of Casamance, having Victor Siho Mehemba Diatta as a leader. The MFDC was established as a regionalist political party that aimed to promote Casamance's economical interests within French West Africa. Diatta was killed some months later in mysterious circumstances and replaced by one of the co-founders, Ibou Diallo. Things started to get more complicated, and the versions of the story differ, with the full independence of Senegal. The supporters of Casamance separatism claim that Senegal's first president Senghor made a promise to MFDC that Casamance would have gained independence after 20 years of being together with Senegal. There are contrasting opinions on this story, and this version will vary depending on who you ask to. Even the written sources that are being used can bring their own bias. For example, some pieces of Casamance history are taken from this publication, the Journal du Pays, which is pro-independence and pro-MFDC.
First of all, the Casamance issue is still a very sensitive topic in Senegal as of today. And this is the reason why the identity of some of the people we spoke with is not disclosed. From our understanding, it is a very political matter. And I don't want to take sides and just focus on the peace-building process. With this said, let me just add that the general feeling of the population is of wanting peace above all. And also the independence movement looks really reduced as of today. This doesn't mean that tensions are over though.
Now, coming back to our story. Discontent started to rise in Casamance already in 1964. In fact, Senegal emanated the Land Ownership Act, which expropriated land without respecting traditional rights in Casamance. The Casamançais started to see the Northerners as taking their land and imposing their powers in their own home. We have to remember one thing that was mentioned in the first episode. Very often, countries that become independent will follow a similar political model of their colonizers. Senegal was not different. And from France, it took the tendency to centralize control and to try to create a national identity for the different ethnic groups in the country. In the case of Senegal, the center of power has always been Dakar, in the north, as well as the dominant ethnic group, Wolof, and the majority religion, Islam. In Casamance, there's a different cultural identity and also more practitioners of Christianity and animism, along with Muslims. It's also very important to note that at the root of this conflict there is not, and I underline not, religious or ethnic tension. There were more protests in the 1970s, with growing discontent around economical disenfranchisement, isolation and lack of development. It is in this decade that the MFDC is refounded by Mamadou Nkrumah Sané and the charismatic figure of Diamakune Senghor, a Catholic priest. Writing the sentiment of injustice, the discourse of the new MFDC was much more for a full independence, with a rhetoric that pictures Senegal as the new colonizers. For sure, the policies of the state didn't help, and things went downhill in 1982, when mass demonstrations in Ziguinchor, the capital of Casamance, were repressed in blood. This year marks the official starting date of the Casamance conflict. The MFDC established its armed faction called Atika, which means warrior in Diola, under the command of Sidi Badji. In the 80s, combatants were armed with traditional weapons, but the 90s saw an escalation of arms and violence. It is in these years that the conflict reached its peak, causing tens of thousands of internally displaced people, or who had to move to neighboring Gambia and Guinea-Bissau. Since the 90s, the Senegalese state and MFDC had reached several ceasefires and partial peace agreements, but clashes have resumed periodically. More recently, major clashes happened also in 2022 and 2023. The main factor is the fact that MFDC progressively divided into smaller factions, often competing with each other as the most legitimate one. The death of Abbé Senghor brought even more internal division among MFDC fighters. The conflict is still considered of low intensity, having caused 5,000 casualties in 4 years and around 60,000 displaced people. Among the main factions of today, there is the one led by Salif Sadio, who had bases near the Gambian border and who sees independence as non-negotiable. Another major faction is the one led by César Atou Badiaté, which signed 2 major peace deals in the past years. There are also other smaller factions. From the information we could gather, the average age of the combatants is pretty high, and their numbers have reduced gradually, since it has been difficult for them to enlist young recruits. Also, it's important to note how, in Casamance, several illegal economies of war have developed, including illegal logging and drug trafficking.
When we were in Dakar, we spoke with several people who worked in the peace process. And definitely one of the highlights was talking with Mame Khady Diouf, head of mission at the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, and who facilitated the latest peace negotiations between the Senegalese state and part of the MFDC factions back in February.
The ideal of separation that was pushed before by the leaders of the MFDC is no longer the same than today. Yes, independence was at the, separating, let's separate from Senegal. We are not the same because, as you mentioned, we are separated by the Gambia. The centralized government doesn't really consider us citizens. They are not here. We don't have a lot of Casamance leaders within the government, etc. So they had a lot of frustrations and a lot of, that I think, in my opinion, were true of how it wasn't well handled, and the first governments tried to repress and to violently also the demonstrations. And so all those things that happened, the having the Gambia not having roads and not being able to connect easily from the north, where they felt like the development was focused there and not in the Casamance, which is very green, and you will see when you go, very different from Dakar and from the rest, because again, here we are more Sahelian over here, and over there it's closer to where it rains a lot. It's very green and it has a lot of economic opportunities in terms of crops, etc. So what they felt was also that a lot of people from the north, as they call it, were coming to the south, to Casamance, to get money and go back to exploit the soil, and go back and bring back the money to Dakar, so and other regions. So there's a lot of those feelings. There are a lot of those feelings that were valid, if you will. But again, did that warrant separations? That's the question, or independence. And so yes, in the beginning it was very intense and it had a lot of support, as you said, a lot of support from the communities in the beginning. But throughout the years, again, with all movements, you have they go again. At some point, you will have some of their members who will go against their own people or their own population. So they started killings and all, these things that are, raping also, etc. Again, in a war. But then that started to decrease also the confidence or the trust that the populations had in some of them, if I will. It's not all of them, again, because you have different factions and it's fragmented. But again, when the factions felt like one village or one person in that village didn't, support them or wasn't part of the ideal, they would go and kill them because they felt like they were working for the Senegalese government. So that also didn't work in their favor, right? So they would say, oh, this person, is the one who went and told the military that you guys were here, and so they would go. Or if you were not willing to participate, because populations participated by giving money, or by sending their children, or by just letting them stay in the village. And also, but for others, they pushed the populations out, expelled them from their villages, went and occupied their fields, their farms, and took the crops, and the population weren't able to come back. So throughout the years, that also contributed to, as I said, a decrease in the trust and a decrease in supporting them.
We were also able to hear more details on the peace agreement signed in February.
So the signing of this agreement in February in Bissau actually comes at the heel of modalities that were signed in 2022, to be precise, August 4th, 2022, between the government of Senegal through its Comité ad hoc and the MFDC, so Mr. Cesar Atout's Badiat's faction. And during the signing of those modalities, there was a number of things that were agreed upon. And in 2025, the 21st and 22nd of February, we put once again those modalities on the table. They were discussed, and there was a series of points that were agreed upon, and that's what was signed in Bissau. So you could say that those were the two parties agreed on different set of points. One, I can cite one, which was that the MFDC wanted to make sure that the communities could come back to their villages, and that they were conscious that the Plan Diomaye pour la Casamance was also being set up. And also the government of Senegal did not agree to having the Casamance takes its independence, because it was one of the points that was also discussed during the 3 days in Bissau. So there are a number of, I think, 7 points that were discussed, and I can say that this showed the willingness of both parties to find lasting peace. Again, it's not the signing of those the document doesn't mean that that's the end of it, but that we are on track, that the two parties are on track to signing a final peace agreement. Because again, there are modalities that need to be worked through, and as an organization which mediates, is a mediator between the two parties, we are working with both of them in order to find compromises, consensus on the different issues, so that the communities can come back to their villages, so that there can be lasting peace.
One aspect that we wanted to know more about were the regional implications of the Casamance conflict. In fact, the neighbors Guinea-Bissau and the Gambia have been active actors both in the conflict and in the peace process. Two main examples. First, MFDC was heavily involved in the Guinea-Bissau civil war that happened between 1998 and 1999. It is actually believed that this war, which was fought between President Vieira and military officer Ansoumana Mame, was a direct consequence of the Casamance conflict, due to Vieira allegedly smuggling of weapons to MFDC. Second is the ECOWAS military intervention in the Gambia in 2017. At the 2016 Gambia presidential elections, authoritarian President Yahya Jammeh, who ruled the country from 1994 to 2016, refused to concede victory to Adama Barrow. This led to massive protests and a constitutional crisis, bringing to the ECOWAS intervention, led by Senegal. Jammeh went into exile in Equatorial Guinea. It was all in the Senegal's interest to intervene, since Jammeh, who has ethnic and familial connections to Casamance, has supported MFDC, allowing combatants to establish safe bases in the Gambian territory. MFDC used to have bases also in Guinea-Bissau. But now, one of the factors that furtherly weaken MFDC is the fact that both Guinea-Bissau and the Gambia are aligned with Senegal.
You cannot start negotiations or have lasting peace without having the involvement of Guinea-Bissau here or the Gambia, because again, it's our neighboring country. They are our neighboring countries. You also had a lot of the combatants that have families and are based on the other side of the border. So in the case of Guinea-Bissau, you have a lot of the combatants who have their wives, children, and families who are based there, but you have also a lot of refugees who left Senegal to go to Bissau. So, you necessarily have to talk between governments. They have to talk to each other, and that's why we've been having our meetings, and these meetings between the Senegalese government and the MFDC in Bissau, where the Bissau Guinean president and the country are the guarantors, if I can say so. So from the beginning, it was clear to us as mediators that both countries have been involved in the past and need to still be involved. And one other thing, which is we share populations, so you have and languages. So you cannot solve the issue in this region of Senegal, in the Casamance, without involving the Guinean government, population, and people. And the parties themselves will tell you that they need to be involved. And again, for Guinea-Bissau, with the history they have, the MFDC has been involved in their political internal. They are no longer, which is great, but they have been involved in the past in their internal conflict, if I can say so, political conflict. And so that's why also the Bissau-Guinean government wants to make sure that they are willing to talk and not doing anything in Guinea-Bissau. But as I said, you have a lot of refugees and other also populations or people who became Bissau Guinean because they asked for Bissau Guinean citizenship also. And one last thing that I will say is that in the Casamance, you have a lot of what they will call, it's very mystical. So you have what they call the bois sacré, and also a lot of rituals where they have king and queens. But these king and queens are not like Queen Charlotte or etc., but they are within the traditional customs, traditional rituals, etc. And they share a lot of these rituals with Guinea-Bissau. So you have some kings or the leaders of these, what they call these bois sacrés, etc., that are based in Guinea-Bissau, for example. So that's how I was saying, culturally, we are linked and traditionally, and so conflict in Senegal, in the Casamance region, has to involve, for it to be solved definitively, you have to involve also the neighboring countries. And they have been very cooperative and very helpful for the negotiations. So when we were there in 2022, as I spoke about earlier, and also in 2025, and for all the meetings that we are having with the combatants, because when we have preparations for the negotiations with the Senegalese government, we do those sessions in Guinea-Bissau with the combatants, with the political wing and with the combatant wing. So we go back and forth and we have those meetings there. So they've been very helpful in allowing us to go there without any issues, and let us also help the parties.
Well, at this point, it was time for us to finally go to Casamance ourselves.
There are currently 3 main ways to reach Casamance from Dakar. The first, cheaper but longer, is driving through Gambia. This route has improved with the opening of the Senegambia Bridge in 2019, easing the access to Casamance, since before that, people had to take a crowded ferry over the Gambia River, lengthening even more the already tedious travel. The second way is by taking a 15-hour ferry from Dakar to Ziguinchor. This route was marked by tragedy when in 2002 the ferry MV Le Jola capsized, with a death toll of 1,863, making it the third worst peacetime maritime disaster in history. We opted for the easiest and quickest route, and we took a 50-minute flight from Dakar to Cap Skirring. Cap Skirring at the moment is the only operating airport in Casamance. Already from the airplane, you can see the gradual changing in landscape, with more vegetation and water that appear as you move south. Cap Skirring is a village along the Atlantic coast that is a pretty popular destination, especially among French tourists. On the road from the airport to our accommodation, we could already see that the nature here looks like another world compared to the northern part of Senegal. When we woke up the next morning, it honestly looked like heaven. We had the chance to further explore the territory of Casamance, driving through rice fields, mangroves, and near the impressive Casamance River. During our rides, we could see how the bad road conditions reflect one of the main issues of Casamance: economy. Despite being the most fertile region of Senegal, with huge agricultural and tourist potential and rich in natural resources, Casamance is also its poorest area, with high levels of unemployment, economical disenfranchisement, and lack of opportunities, especially for the youth. This is also the area that was more heavily affected by the Senegalese political crisis in 2023.
This is partly caused by governmental policies, but above all, it is the consequence of decades of conflict that have left this region in a state of limbo, not really at war, not really at peace.
So, in Dakar, during our meeting with Mame, we wonder what are the key factors that could bring a real definitive peace in Casamance.
I think the few key factors are making sure that dialogue is still there. So when I say making sure that dialogue is still there, is making sure that communities are involved, the warring parties are also involved. So the MFDC, their combatant wing and their political wing, and also the government of Senegal, so the state and all the organization, civil society organizations. So I think that the key factors for having positive peace is having inclusion, so having a very inclusive process, knowing also how to structure it so that, sometimes at the table, negotiation table, you might not have, civil society, but just making sure that communication, there is a canal of communication. So when I say communication, meaning whatever transpires at the negotiation table can also be communicated to civil society and also the communities. It's very difficult sometimes when you are in a process to make sure that it happens, because there are issues or topics that need to be discussed discreetly and others that need to be shared publicly. But I think one of the key factors also is making sure that you have the interests, the best interests of the communities and the populations at heart. Because, when you speak to the warring parties, they tell you, we have the interests of the communities of the populations at heart. So we want to, for the MFDC, they will tell you, we took up arms to defend our communities, our populations. And when you talk to the state, through the military, they tell you our mission is to protect the communities and the population. So again, what's the common factor? It's the populations, the communities. So I think one of the key factors in ensuring that there is positive peace is making sure that we always put them at the heart of the dialogue or the discussions. Because if that's the case, then both parties and also all the other actors will push to get to lasting peace quicker. And also, I think that in a world where, it's been 40 years again since the conflict started in the Casamance, 82, 83, and today we are in 2025. A lot of things have happened in the world, in the country, and I think we are at the stage where even those that maybe took up arms before no longer have the same ambitions or the same interest, the same drive, exactly, and everybody's tired. And I think at the end of the day, Senegal is one, if I can say so. True, it has had its daughters, sons that took up arms because they, looked for another ideal independence. But I am convinced that every situation can be solved at the negotiation table, around the table. And to me, it's like, it's throughout, talking, negotiation, mediation, that you can truly find what, this party, in terms of what the MFDC truly wants, and to also find out what the government or the state can do in order to maybe right some wrongs or make sure that they are able to help them in achieving lasting peace. And one of the things also that I like during the negotiations, and as I said, facilitator, mediator, is that both parties will tell you there is no winner and no loser. So it's at the end of the day, what we need to to make sure of is that we do have lasting peace, and that there is nobody who there is the weapons don't, we don't hear them anymore. So that's what we don't hear the weapons anymore, because everybody is tired, as I said, and communities want, populations want to come back to their villages that they have left for 20, 30 years. Some have died, others were young when they left their villages and went to either Guinea or Gambia as refugees. Others were displaced in the other regions of Senegal. And when you look at them, they tell you their stories. They are tired. They don't have, in the areas where they don't have their own homes, and they have lands in the Casamance. So they want to come back. And in Casamance, and the Casamance, in the culture, people are very attached to land, and it's a cultural thing. And I think being separated and being away from that land has caused a lot of despair and sorrow.
Land. It seems that so many conflicts in history have been rooted in land. And when looked from above, the land of Casamance seems even more beautiful and stunning.
It gets harder, doesn't it?
Oh my god. Now that I'm scared.
Yeah.
You're showing my scared face.
I am.
But we wanted to hear more voices to understand this conflict better. And we were lucky enough to organize a meeting with Madame Thiam, the president of the Plateforme des Femmes pour la Paix en Casamance, the main women-led organization that was involved in the peace process.
Traditionally, in Casamance, women always had a key role in mediating conflicts, and it is organizations like the Plateforme des Femmes pour la Paix en Casamance that left the veil of fear during the worst years of the conflict, promoting peace dialogue and bringing civil society on the table. To meet her, we had to travel to Ziguinchor, the capital of Casamance. The drive to reach Ziguinchor from Cap Skirring is quite the trip, mainly due to the bad road conditions. One thing we noticed is how in the matter of just 70 kilometers the temperature raises so much. The sea breeze of the Atlantic leaves space for an unforgiving heat. But despite this, Ziguinchor has its own charm even under the midday sun.
Here we are in Ziguinchor, the capital of Casamance, the main town of the south of Senegal. As you can see around, it's very different from Dakar, from the rest of the country. Very green, trees all over. Really beautiful actually.
When we finally met Madame Thiam, it was really emotional. Despite being very busy, she welcomed us at her house, and even with limited time, hearing her perspective on the role of women and on the conflict on a wider level was really insightful.
Effectivement, il y a eu, de cela quelques mois, on a assisté à une cérémonie de dépôt des armes à Mongol par le camp de Jakaï. Nous avons assisté quelques semaines plus tard, quelques mois plus tard, on a entendu à la radio qu'il y a eu une signature d'accord et la Guinée-Bissau était la partie garante. Nous souhaitons tous que la paix arrive là en Casamance. Mais nous souhaitons que tout ce qui doit être fait nous amène à une paix définitive. Parce que, aussi bien pour le dépôt des armes que pour les négociations en Guinée-Bissau, les organisations de la société civile, surtout les organisations de femmes, n'ont pas été impliquées. Le Sénégal a été représenté par le comité ad hoc et par HD. Et la partie combattante, le MFDC, donc avec les branches armées. Il se trouve qu'il y a des organisations de la société civile comme nous qui avons combattu, qui avons travaillé. Nous n'avons pas porté des armes, bien sûr, mais nous avons travaillé dans la sensibilisation pour qu'on arrive à cette situation aujourd'hui de paix, à cette accalmie. Je pense, et en toute simplicité, que s'il y a des accords à signer, on devrait être impliqué pour que nous puissions continuer le travail qu'on est en train de faire. Ça n'a pas été le cas. Les populations dans leur intégralité n'ont pas été impliquées. Si je prends du côté du MFDC également, on a parlé avec une branche du MFDC, une branche de Jakaï. La preuve, hier ou avant-hier, il y a eu des attaques au niveau de Jakaï. Ça veut dire donc qu'il y a une partie des combattants qui n'a pas été impliquée dans la résolution du conflit. Pour résoudre ce conflit-là, il faut des actions qui soient inclusives, qu'on mette tout le monde dans le bain, qu'on s'asseye et qu'on puisse discuter de cette question-là, pour que la paix revienne définitivement en Casamance. Tout le monde souhaite la paix. Mais de la façon qu'on est en train de s'y prendre, j'ai bien peur qu'on n'ait pas de résultats probants.
Madame Thiam's words were proven even more real once we left Casamance. Because in the second half of April, there have been new clashes between soldiers and factions of the MFDC, and one Senegalese soldier is still in the hands of the rebels.
We understood that to really reach a final end of this conflict, civil society has to be fully involved in the peace process. And this is especially challenging when both the Senegalese state and the MFDC factions have been lacking in this. But it is even more important when you realize that it is the general interest and sentiment of the population of wanting peace above all after more than 40 years of conflict.
An additional challenge is the one brought by landmines that have been left both by MFDC and the army. Completing mine clearance in Casamance is fundamental to allow the return of displaced people in their villages. There is a feeling of hope in the new government. When in the last episode I was telling about the recent election protests, Casamance was the area most affected, with harsh repression from authorities that also resulted in deaths, and a kind of embargo that was established for 10 months between 2023 and 2024. Ferries and flights were stopped. But the local population has shown great support for Prime Minister Ousmane Sonko, who has been the mayor of Ziguinchor, and President Diomaye Faye has launched the ambitious Diomaye Plan, promising of bringing economic investment, reintegration in civil society of combatants who deposed their arms, and a final resolution of the conflict.
If you come back to 2025, as I said, you have a world that's evolving. You have younger people who, want to find jobs, who want to, technologically savvy, who want to see, who go to school and then go to university, see other things and want other things. So then the support also decreases furthermore, right? So that's what has changed, the shift. And also because you no longer can recruit as you were in the past, and also because how are you able to actually defend or argue the position of independence when the government also has built roads, has tried. It's not perfect again, and it's not, there's a lot more that needs to be done, but it has worked to link the northern part of the country to the southern part without having to do the big detour, because it's not, it doesn't cut the country into perfectly. To Tambacounda and Kédougou, you can go to the Casamance, but it has worked on the Fahafeni. So when you take the road, when you get to Kaolack, you can cross the bridge. That has helped a lot, and then it reduces the time you spend also on the road. So that has been done. That was during President Macky Sall's tenure, but also a lot of the roads linking, or the pistes, what they call is laterite, like it's red roads between the villages. They've worked a lot on that also, and tried in the border villages, the villages that border either Guinea or the Gambia, to make sure that there is access to electricity, to water, and there's a lot to be done. Again, I am not saying that it's perfect, but there are things that are being done. So the government strategy was to also, yes, we are making sure that we have the military present, and that's making sure that these villages are secure, but we also go on the economic front. So make sure that we connect this road. So again, that also decreases the griefs or the revendications and things that the MFDC is going to ask for. And what also hasn't worked for the MFDC is that it's very fragmented. So there are a lot of people who claim that they want to be what they call the Secretary General of the MFDC, which they haven't had one since the passing of Abe Jamakun, who was the leader since then. And so you have other leaders on the political front that are based in European countries who claim it, but then on the local level, they are not recognized. And so the fragmentation hasn't also helped in terms of, make sure that this ideal of wanting to have independence, it hasn't helped to keep it strong. And again, populations that have left for 20, 30 years want to come back. They see things have changed since they left, and they aspire to better. So is it to still stay fighting? They know that within the regional context, there's not going to be partition of the country into either separation or independence. And the MFDC still believes in that. Some of them want that, but I think that they are still willing to discuss and see if there is a way to find a credible solution. As I said, it's fragmented. This is one faction. You still have Salif Sadio's faction who is on the other side, and that's another step. So again, if we have a peace accord with the southern factions, it would be definitely great, and it will again bring us a step closer to have a definitive peace. But again, we'll have to make sure that the other factions also come to the fore.
At the moment, Casamance is suspended between tensions that periodically re-emerge and lots of hopes for a final resolution. Time will tell which direction it will go. We want to bring home with us the optimism and hope that we heard from many.